Picture yourself in the mid-19th century, standing before a mirror taller than you've ever seen, its gilded frame reflecting not just your face but the enormous task ahead. You are not simply getting dressed, you are preparing for war. Not the kind fought with rifles and cannons, but a private battle with fabric, steel, and society itself. Each morning for a Victorian woman began with a ritual that was equal parts discipline, endurance, and choreography. The first layer was deceptively simple, a thin linen shift. To the modern eye it may look like an oversized nightgown, but it served a critical purpose, protecting the costly outer garments from sweat and oil, ensuring the expensive silks and velvets would last longer. Linen was breathable, washable, and mercifully soft against skin often pinched raw by corsetra. Then came the corset, a device that blurred the line between fashion and punishment. To the Victorians, it was not merely a garment but a symbol. A tightly laced waist spoke of discipline, wealth, and self-control. It reshaped the torso into the coveted hourglass figure. But at a cost: shortness of breath, fainting spells, and in extreme cases, ribs permanently altered. Some young women who grew up wearing them never developed their bodies fully. Nature was disciplined into shape by bone, whalebone, and steel. To draw a deep breath was nearly impossible. Shallow breathing became the rhythm of daily life. Over this prison of laces, the next layers added both weight and grandeur. Petticoats, sometimes 6 or more, were stacked like the rings of a tree, each stiffened with starch, quilting, or horsehair. Their purpose was twofold: to add warmth in drafty homes and, more importantly, to give skirts the bell-like volume society demanded. Each additional petticoat was a declaration of status. The more layers, the more costly the upkeep, the more space you commanded in a world that sought to confine women in every other way. But the true marvel, or nightmare, depending on perspective, was the crinoline. Imagine a skeletal dome of steel hoops, suspended one above the other by narrow tapes, stretching as wide as 6 feet across. To move in it required training, much like learning to drive a carriage or sail a ship. A misstep could send skirts tipping, knocking over tables or brushing against open flames from the ever-present fireplaces and gas lamps. The dangers were real. Newspapers of the time recorded countless accidents, some fatal, where a woman's dress caught fire, the steel cage turning her gown into a deadly furnace. And yet, society embraced these garments as emblems of grace. Entire pieces of furniture had to be redesigned to accommodate them: wider chairs, deeper carriages, and sofas without arms so ladies could perch without crushing the delicate structures beneath. To pass through a doorway meant turning sideways and calculating angles. To sit required lowering oneself carefully, arranging the hoops so the skirt didn't balloon upward like an umbrella turned inside out. What to us seems absurd was, to them, daily routine. This elaborate ensemble transformed women into what one historian called walking monuments to fashion. But beneath the grandeur lay a relentless practical problem. How, inside this moving fortress of fabric and steel, could a woman manage the simplest human need? To eat, to walk, to dance. Each was already a feat. But to use the bathroom? That was a puzzle bordering on the impossible. And it was in solving this puzzle that Victorian ingenuity revealed itself most astonishingly. Because hidden beneath the lace and velvet, beneath the 6-foot cages and mountain of skirts, was a world of quiet innovation, secret strategies, and extraordinary resilience. The daily act of relieving oneself, so ordinary, so universal, became in Victorian society a matter of stealth, engineering, and at times, high-stakes performance. This is where our story truly begins. If the crinoline was the fortress, then the chamber pot was the hidden weapon, an object so ordinary, yet so essential, that without it Victorian life would have been impossible. Far from being crude containers, these pots were carefully designed tools of survival, shaped to fit the strange requirements of women imprisoned in 6 feet of steel and 20 pounds of cloth. The typical chamber pot of the era was oval rather than round. Its elongated form meant to slide neatly between layers of skirts and hoops. Some even had curved lips to better nestle against the body, allowing their user to maneuver with a degree of precision that modern audiences might find astonishing. The best pots had lids that closed tightly, controlling odors but also sending a silent signal to household staff. full, or empty. In wealthy homes, one did not leave such things in plain sight. Instead, chamber pots were concealed inside exquisite furniture, chairs with hollow seats, cabinets with secret compartments, and elegant wooden commodes whose craftsmanship disguised their true purpose. Servants played an indispensable, if invisible, role in this ritual. They glided through grand houses like shadows, checking pots, emptying them, and returning them spotless, all without disturbing the illusion of refinement. Their labor made it possible for the wealthy to maintain appearances. To be a maid in such a household meant becoming a kind of stagehand in a never-ending performance, ensuring that the machinery of daily life remained hidden behind velvet curtains. But even with the right equipment and attentive servants, the act itself required a choreography that bordered on acrobatics. A woman could not simply lift her skirts, she bore the weight of layer upon layer, steel bones, and starched cloth. Instead, she perfected a method that combined balance, positioning, and control. The chamber pot would be placed discreetly beneath her. Then, with careful shifts of fabric, practiced angling of the hips, and astonishing bodily awareness, she could relieve herself without removing a single layer of clothing. It was, in essence, a ballet of necessity, a quiet performance repeated countless times throughout her life. At formal gatherings, the process took on even greater complexity. Wealthy households provided retiring rooms, lavish bathroom lounges furnished with couches, mirrors, and elegant chairs, all attended by ladies' maids who functioned like pit crews in a race. A guest might slip away from the ballroom for only a few minutes, but in that time a whole team went to work, lifting, arranging, steadying, and then discreetly restoring every fold of fabric to its rightful place. When she returned, no one could guess what had transpired. The illusion of effortless elegance was preserved. But this polished ritual was the privilege of the upper classes. For working women, life was harsher, the strategies more makeshift. A factory girl could hardly rely on hidden furniture or the aid of a maid. Instead, she might use crude pots in crowded boarding houses or, more often, simply endure long hours without relief. In cities, public conveniences for women barely existed, forcing many to improvise or risk humiliation. The contrast between rich and poor was written into the very logistics of the body. What united them all, however, was the secrecy. No polite woman spoke openly of such things. To discuss the mechanics of relief was to risk social ruin. Yet every woman, from the grand lady descending her marble staircase to the laundress hunched over her washtub, faced the same inescapable truth: the human body had its needs. And so, beneath the layers of propriety, beneath the towering architecture of fashion, a hidden system of chamber pots and silent rituals kept Victorian society moving. And as we'll see next, the situation grew even more peculiar when we realize that, for much of this period, many of these women were not wearing underwear at all. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that often shocks modern audiences. For much of the Victorian era, many women simply did not wear underwear in the way we imagine it today. Beneath the fortress of skirts, hoops, and petticoats, there was often nothing at all. The sheer volume of fabric was considered modest enough, a moving wall of protection that made additional undergarments unnecessary, or so society believed. At first, this seemed practical. Why add yet another layer under 20 pounds of clothing? But the absence of underwear created risks. And when paired with the unpredictability of weather, those risks often turned into very public spectacles. Newspapers of the mid-19th century gleefully reported on scenes that must have mortified the women involved. A sudden gust of wind in a busy street, an enormous crinoline catching the air like a sail, and in an instant, the entire structure flipping upward to reveal what was never meant to be seen. Satirical prints and cartoons lampooned these incidents mercilessly. Publications like Punch depicted women as clumsy hot air balloons, their skirts upturned in ways that mocked not only their clothing but their dignity. Men jeered, children laughed, and women, who had been told their worth lay in modesty and composure, found themselves humiliated in public. Fashion had promised elegance, but it often delivered disaster. The solution was as ingenious as it was peculiar: split-crotch drawers. These undergarments were not solid pieces like modern panties. Instead, They consisted of two separate pant legs joined only at the waistband, leaving a gap in the middle. To our eyes, this seems like a flaw. But to the Victorians, it was brilliance. The opening allowed women to manage their bathroom needs without the impossible task of removing layers of skirts, petticoats, and hoops. At the same time, the drawers provided a safety net against accidental exposure. They restored a measure of dignity in a world that often denied women control over their own appearances. Adoption of split drawers spread quickly, though not without debate. Moralists argued that such garments were unladylike, too suggestive of men's trousers. Others worried that the very convenience of the design might encourage improper behavior. But practicality often wins over purity, and before long, the drawers became a staple of women's wardrobes. They represented not just a fashion innovation but a quiet act of rebellion, women reclaiming a small measure of agency over their own bodies. Yet even this innovation did not entirely silence the critics. In crowded cities, scandals continued. A crinoline caught by the wind could still reveal far too much. Writers of the time described scenes of chaos on blustery days, when a street full of women looked like a forest of bell tents flapping helplessly in the breeze. For every practical advance, society seemed determined to find a way to turn it into mockery. But beneath the ridicule lay something deeper. These accidents and solutions revealed the fragile balance Victorian women walked every day. They were expected to be paragons of modesty, yet they were dressed in fashions so impractical that modesty became nearly impossible. Society demanded elegance, while simultaneously setting traps that could strip that elegance away in a single gust of wind. The invention of split-crotch drawers may sound odd to us now, but it marked a turning point, a moment when women's clothing quietly acknowledged reality. And in the struggle between expectation and necessity, reality always, eventually, found a way to win. If the clothing was burdensome and the chamber pot was ingenious, the matter of hygiene presented an even harsher reality. For modern readers, it may be difficult to imagine life without the small luxuries we take for granted: flush toilets, soft tissue, and store-bought sanitary products. For Victorian women, however, such things were either non-existent or only just beginning to emerge. Toilet paper, as we know it, did not exist in most homes until the very late 19th century. Instead, people used whatever was available: old newspapers, catalog pages, scraps of cloth, or even natural materials like moss, grass, or corn cobs. For the poor, these were necessities. For the wealthy, softer solutions existed. Affluent households often supplied their women with pieces of fine linen cloth, cut into squares, laundered carefully, and reused. Imagine the constant labor this required: servants collecting, washing, drying, and folding these intimate cloths in complete silence, never speaking of the work but ensuring the cycle continued. Menstruation was another challenge shrouded in secrecy. In a society where the subject was never spoken aloud, even between mothers and daughters, women had to rely on whispered knowledge and personal improvisation. The most common method was the use of homemade cloth pads, secured in place by a contraption known as the tea bandage. This device was essentially a cloth belt that wrapped around the waist, with strips that extended downward to hold absorbent rags, wool, or even moss. These makeshift pads needed changing constantly, sometimes a dozen or more times a day during heavy flow, all beneath skirts that were complicated enough to make any simple task exhausting. Imagine the courage it required to attend a dinner party, to sit through church services, or to endure long carriage rides while managing these delicate, uncomfortable contraptions in total silence. There were no products sold in stores, no public discussion, no medical guidance. It was a private struggle faced by every woman, yet erased from polite society's memory. Even outside the realm of menstruation, hygiene was a monumental task. Laundry was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. For many households, it was undertaken only twice a year, in events ominously known as Great Wash Days. These days were ordeals of boiling water, heavy scrubbing, and backbreaking labor that left washerwomen exhausted and raw-handed. Outer garments, with their yards of delicate fabric and intricate beadwork, were rarely washed at all. Instead, they were brushed, aired, and dusted with powders to mask odors. This is why the linen shift and later the split drawers were so critical. they were washable layers. Barriers between the body and the expensive dresses. By keeping these inner layers relatively clean, women could preserve gowns that otherwise would have been impossible to maintain. Still, even under the best conditions, garments carried with them the unmistakable scent of daily life. In a world without modern deodorants, soaps, or detergents, smells were as much a part of the Victorian home as the ticking of a clock. The burden of maintaining hygiene fell overwhelmingly on women, while men could step outside to relieve themselves, or depend on simpler wardrobes and routines. Women were bound by layers of fabric, by silence around their bodily functions, and by expectations that they remain graceful no matter the circumstances. The weight of these expectations was not just physical but psychological. To smile at a ball, to converse wittily at dinner, all while concealing the constant logistics of cloth pads, chamber pots, and sweat-stained corsets that required a resilience few acknowledged at the time. And yet, women endured. They managed these cycles of labor, secrecy, and discomfort with a kind of stoic ingenuity. In doing so, they created quiet systems of survival, turning necessity into routine, and routine into tradition. But as heavy as these burdens were, they were not endured in isolation. The story of Victorian hygiene is also a story of shared spaces, of social norms, and of strange cultural practices that now seem unthinkable. And it is to that hidden world of privacy, or rather, the lack of it, that we now turn. For the Victorian woman, privacy as we imagine it today was a rare luxury. The idea of a locked bathroom door, of handling one's needs entirely alone, barely existed. Chamber pots were often shared within families, used in common sleeping spaces, and emptied by servants who handled them without question. At social gatherings, gentlemen might discreetly step into gardens or alleys, while women vanished into retiring rooms, often with the help of maids. The notion of private bodily space was foreign. What mattered was discretion, not solitude. Even waste itself carried unexpected significance. In some periods, chamber pot contents weren't regarded merely as refuse but as valuable resources. Urine, for example, could be collected and processed into saltpeter, a vital ingredient in gunpowder. During times of war, governments quite literally used bodily waste to fuel military campaigns. A Victorian lady's chamber pot might, unknowingly, contribute to the machinery of empire. Beneath these strange customs, however, lay a vast hidden network of knowledge and labor. Mothers taught daughters the secret techniques of maneuvering skirts, managing menstruation, and signaling discreetly to friends in public when help was needed. Servants became experts in the art of invisibility, assisting without ever acknowledging the act. Women developed coded languages, small gestures, subtle words, that allowed them to communicate needs without ever breaking the iron rules of propriety. Maintaining these wardrobes required armies of laborers, laundresses, seamstresses, maids, and dressmakers whose entire livelihoods depended on sustaining the elaborate systems of women's dress and hygiene. For every lady who glided through a ballroom, there were countless hands working in the shadows to make that illusion possible. The sheer economic weight of these practices shaped entire industries. And yet, change was inevitable. Fashion, though slow to shift, eventually bent beneath the pressure of practicality. The dangers of crinolines, fires, falls, humiliations, combined with the growing demands of modern life. Bicycles offered women new freedom of movement, and with them came clothing better suited to mobility. The First World War accelerated this transformation. Women working in factories, hospitals, and offices could not be bound by cages of steel and oceans of fabric. Bustles shrank, skirts shortened, corsets loosened. By the early 20th century, the towering architecture of Victorian dress had begun to collapse. But the legacy of that earlier era remained. The quiet ingenuity women developed, finding ways to preserve dignity, hygiene, and composure in impossible circumstances, laid the groundwork for later revolutions. The discomfort of restrictive fashion helped fuel the desire for reform, not only in clothing but in social expectations. The struggles of Victorian women to manage the simplest human needs revealed the absurdity of imprisoning half the population in impractical costumes. That realization, slowly but surely, contributed to wider debates about women's rights, independence, and autonomy. And so, What seems to us like a bizarre historical curiosity, the chamber pots, the split drawers, the endless petticoats, was in truth a theater of survival. These women endured, adapted, and even triumphed, transforming necessity into strategy. Their story is not merely one of inconvenience but of resilience, the determination to maintain dignity, elegance, and humanity even when the world conspired to deny them comfort. The next time you close a bathroom door, slip into simple clothes, or enjoy the ease of modern hygiene, remember the long, hidden journey that brought us here. Remember the women who navigated corridors in 6-foot cages of steel, who endured the mockery of scandal sheets, who bore the weight of silence around menstruation, and who still managed to move with grace. Their legacy is not only in the garments they wore but in the ingenuity they embodied, proof that human adaptability thrives even in the most absurd of circumstances.